Does Hollywood have an anti-white bias? Should actors be distinguished from the roles they play? And is there any value for Christians in watching monster movies? We talk about all this and more on this episode of Faith and Pop Culture. Hey, well, what's up, everyone? Welcome to episode number 18 of the Faith and Pop Culture Podcast. It is me, your host, Daniel, and I am joined at the desk, as I always am, by the pineapple to my ruined piece of pizza, Mr. Samuel David Camp. What is up?
Not too much. Trying to survive this summer heat. It's quite stifling.
Will you be doing that, though, with pizza with pineapple or not? I feel like...
Oh, yeah. Definitely with pineapple
Ooh.
and homemade bacon.
Okay, well... I feel like that's what's the saying? Like putting lipstick on a pig. Like, bacon is good, but there's not enough bacon that can compensate for the fact that you've tarnished your piece of pizza with pineapple.
Yeah, well, we always make Hawaiian pizza on Friday nights at our household, and it is the bomb.
I wish I knew this before we started the podcast, because there's this... I feel like you can tell a lot about a person by if they put pineapple on their pizza.
But obviously not enough to not make them your co-host.
Well, yeah. Well, I've had some suspicions. The question is,
we can agree.
Do the Italians put it on their pizza?
Well, no, but if that's your standards, and they also, there's a lot of other things Italians don't do to their food that we have Americanized, sadly.
Which I have had pizza in Italy on my honeymoon, and let me tell you, I almost wish I hadn't, because
it'll ruin you.
It's like
I had
a copy.
There is a lasagna that I had in Rome that, if I mention it, my wife still gets upset because I ordered it and she didn't, and it has forever haunted her because it was so good, and she only had one bite and it was mine. So
see, I just had my wedding anniversary, 14 blissful years, and for all 14 of those years, almost without fail, if we go to a restaurant, my wife makes a bad choice, I make a great choice, and then she guilts me into switching, and I just eat things that I don't want. But
that's the secret to a happy marriage.
Yeah, at least one of us orders something good. But speaking of things that are perhaps tarnishing and ruining our experience of life, Hollywood. So there's always, especially as...
it was the best of times. It was the worst of times.
So those best of times were, for some people, far off in the distance and distant memory. So kind of our main thing to get into is this, it's been a buzzworthy, you never have to look far to find a story about people mad at Hollywood.
Yeah.
That is, you just open up social media, scroll down a little bit, and someone's...
Does the day end in Y?
And to be fair, doesn't necessarily mean that things aren't valid.
True.
There's always things to talk about. And there's kind of a story that that went viral, a lot of discussion and kind of people weighing in on it because it seemed to confirm or a lot of existing narratives and suspicions.
Suspicion, yeah.
In many ways, it's sort of the say the quiet part out loud thing of okay, we've been saying this, and then now we can kind of have a more definitive proof, and that is sort of this whole narrative about Hollywood recently and its anti-white bias, which again is just one part of the wider discussion just about diversity and stuff that's been going on for the last couple of years with the Oscars and all those controversies. But the kind of the content of this, the roots of it is a man, Michael Giordano, who is Disney's senior vice president for business affairs. He was caught on some hidden cameras. I think he had maybe had a few drinks and his lips were loose, and he was sharing some kind of behind closed doors secrets about Disney, which again, probably is not going to end up in a good place. And kind of the content of those comments that has been getting a lot of attention are about the hiring process and who they hire, who they don't hire. So a couple of quotes that he said, and then we can kind of get into what we do with any of this. Said, kind of speaking about Disney, said, they're very careful about messaging because they don't want to get sued for discrimination in either direction. But certainly there have been times where, there's no way we're hiring a white male. and kind of the person who's talking to him kind of pushes back and says, okay, because this sort of, like a subtle thing, like how, how do they say this? And he said, no. I said, there's definitely times when it's not unspoken. It is spoken, and it can be as blatant as saying, there's no way we're hiring a white male for this role. So not a whole lot of
Not a lot of ambiguity. Yeah.
with that. And kind of he continues, says, they might say something like, we're not looking at the usual suspects for this job. So it's not like a legally actionable thing, but everyone knows what it means. And again, there's more that he kind of says in that, but those are the comments that sparked the most opinions, conversations, because it does, in many ways, seem to, like I said, like affirm, like there has been a criticism towards Hollywood, but I think even more specifically to like Disney, that sort of forced diversity, or like that there's a reluctance to hire white males in lead roles anymore, and like a lot of the like the Disney animated movies or like the Star Wars shows, which is under that, or even like the more recent Marvel movies seem to like reflect some of that commitment. So I thought we could get into that, because this is I think it is a valid conversation, although perhaps one that has more I guess maybe more nuance than quickly rushing to type up that hot take, clickbaity, aggressive headline. But what are some of your initial takeaways from this?
Yeah, I mean, first, I always kind of, and we talked about this before, but I always kind of feel a little sympathy for people who are caught on like hidden cameras on like what they think is a date, but it's obviously like a sting operation to get him to say the quiet part out loud. So, and it also seemed like, maybe Michael had some a little bit of a maybe grievance with Disney and maybe his own sort of upward mobility within the company. And so I would say that is also, he's coming at this as someone who thinks he's on a date with someone and saying these things. And I think, so that sort of is maybe the setting for it. And I think you can take this, and as many have, run with the, look, Hollywood has an anti-white bias. But I don't know that that's necessarily the case. Like, I think there are some issues that he raised. One, I don't know how much of it is like legally actionable. So I think there's a lot of people getting worked up and like talking about lawsuits and all this kind of stuff that, like, I don't know that we're at that stage. But I also think that there are, Disney in particular has shown a real aggression for hiring diverse cast, but also it sounds like diverse employees and executives and all that sort of stuff, which I think is not necessarily mean that it's like an anti-white bias. And so, I mean, I think there is a distinction between trying to hire diversity versus like never, like, I don't know that Disney is never hiring white males.
Yeah.
And so I think it's so easy to read into this what you want it to be, I guess, or what some people want it to be. And that is like, they hate white males.
Yeah. Cause like if you need like, bullets for the culture war, like this will fill up your, like this, you can take this and this, I mean, this will preach, to use church talk. Like, this very much can align. But kind of like you said, like, I think if you want to sort of this, easy, take it as cultural stuff, you can. But I think to understand it at like a deeper level, there is more nuance. Again, not that there's not issues and things that come out of this that are valid, and like, I guess it's not a nothing story, but it's maybe not as clear cut. And I think we can be disingenuous to like treat it as a very like, because even like like a lot of the headlines are, Hollywood has, as though like this guy is like, Jeff Hollywood, because like that he represents like, if for one thing, he's only speaking on behalf of one studio.
Yeah.
I think you can make the educated guess that what happens in one place is probably happening in them all.
Yeah.
But but he himself is not. And then he's not speaking in the capacity of his work either. Like he's speaking,
Right.
to someone that he thinks is off the records. Like you can twist it a little bit and like make it a bigger issue than it is. And I think even just the way you frame it, I think changes. Like because is it anti-white or is it like pro diversity? Because those aren't
Yeah.
necessarily. I mean, those can walk step in step with each other, but not necessarily. Like there's a more positive take to this that is possible, hypothetical at least. Like,
Yeah.
hey, we've like think of some franchise or something, and like, hey, we've had white leads in these series, like, and there's pressure. There's people that are pushing us to tell different stories and stuff. Like, for this new one, like we can't hire another white person. Like it needs to be different, which like to me isn't that's not anti-white. That's
Yeah.
it, some white actor maybe pays the price for that push, but like that's more like, hey, we just need to get diverse, and to do that, you gotta
You've got
cast
it. Yeah.
diverse people. You
Right.
gotta cast other types. Again, because the same can maybe apply to like gender or different things. So I do think there's more nuance to it than just like this. What even his if you take his comments, just purely at face value, doesn't necessarily lead to the conclusion that like Hollywood just hates white males. Like,
Yeah. And I think if you look at the executive pool of Hollywood, like it would probably be a very different story. Like if you look at all the top VPs across the major studios, like I'm pretty sure it's not anti-white. And then if you look at most leading characters in bigger movies, again, pretty sure those aren't anti-white. Like there's still a lot of like white males in leading roles in major movies. And
because
so it's
even
like,
because like I when these comments came out, like I went and looked just like the last movies I've reviewed, which aren't all Disney movies, but like just to sort of see like because there is this narrative that like if you're a white male in Hollywood, like retire because you're not getting another job, like and like but like to go through the movies that I've seen like in the last 2 years, at least like the big ones that I've reviewed, like I think there's more diversity than there was, but like there are plenty of
yeah,
like plenty of white male actors still getting work in Hollywood. Like I think there can be. I think maybe where you see it the most is like on Extreming or some of these other shows and things where you have a bigger cast and there's more opportunity.
which I think is probably what people who are in favor of, pushing more diversity, um, would probably even push back against that because they would say, hey, you're kind of relegating diversity to streaming and you're not really bringing it in to like your big blockbusters. Like I think so you could even see, I think people could take the position that like they're really not doing enough for diversity because they're only kind of doing that in the streaming side of it, which is sort of like a way for Disney to then come out and say, hey, look at all the diversity we did. But it's like most of it happened in streaming, like none of it happened. I'm not saying it did or didn't, but like, it's a way to kind of, you can shake the numbers however you want to kind of tell whatever narrative you need to tell as a corporation to sort of appease whatever party you're trying to appease at the time.
Yeah, and I think even just like logistically, I think there's more. Again, people would have an issue with this too, but like a lot of the established box office draws are white males, and like people would have, from the other side would have an issue with that. But like, I think that's why you still see a lot of them in Hollywood because like
Yeah.
put Ryan Gosling in a movie and hopefully he'll draw in an audience where you see maybe more diversity. There's more freedom, I guess, to experiment with
Yeah.
because like the actor isn't necessarily the draw always of the show the same way it is like with the like a movie
Yeah, and I think especially with sort of the more franchised properties that particularly in Disney's case, like Marvel,
or like Star
Star
Wars. Like, yeah, you
Wars.
don't necessarily need to have
Yeah, you don't.
you know whoever that Tom Holland play a Jedi in order to like attract people the same way. I mean, they got to do something to attract because they're not doing.
Yeah,
But kind of the point is like, and I do think there are people working in Hollywood that have an anti-white bias. Like, and
sure.
there's people in Hollywood that are flat out racists and like have an
Yeah.
anti everything else. Like that's just the nature of it. I think the issue for me is more just making it too simplistic and like too easy to just affirm the narrative that we want. Because even like I know there's been um, like a lot of I've heard from a lot of people like that there's this trope now that like if there's a villain in a show or a movie, like it's going to be a white male. And I think if you like look at the shows that have come out, that's true. Like almost all of them are white males, um, which you could take that to conclude like, well, Hollywood hates white males, so they're going to make them the villains of all these shows. Where like I think if you look like before things were more polarized and like diverse and stuff, like they've always been white males. Like the difference was most of the heroes, protagonists were also
White
white
males.
males. So
Yeah.
no, so it's more like, hey, people are just there's good, there's evil. It didn't become this racial thing, and I think a lot of the um, like a lot of the push to be more diverse has focused on like the heroes, so that's become more representative, more diverse, and like the villains haven't. They're not casting the diverse stuff. Like there are examples of that,
Yeah.
um, but not as much. So now it seems like there's more. You know, it's just sort of it's an issue of like a narrative. Like how do
It's a
you
perception, I
the
think, that
perception where it can sort of be this confirmation bias, and kind of to end on that, like to what does that mean for Christians? Because like I think there a lot of that is sort of like maybe more at home in like the realm of politics and like identity politics and some of this stuff and
hmm
sort of the issues with it. Like, but like as Christians, like does that matter? Like how do we sort of like is that even something that is like should matter to us? Like should we weigh into what the percentage is of like diversity or non-diversity in Hollywood? And there's a passage in scripture that I think relates to this in Revelation 7, where John's having this vision for sort of what heaven is going to look like. And again, Revelation is a weird book. It's like he's having this trippy vision of things. Like you don't want to read too much into it, but I guess also it's also scripture and a vision given. Like so, I think you should read some into it.
Yeah.
And there's a passage where he's describing what he sees. And he says, after this, I looked, and behold, a great multitude that no one could number, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes with palm branches in their hands, and crying out with a loud voice, salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb. And it's kind of an interesting because I feel like a lot of the discussion about like diversity from the church can almost removes any of the distinction. Like it's hey, there's one human race. We're just souls in
We're neither
bodies.
Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, those.
Yeah, it's sort of like it diminishes that matters at all for Christians because hey, at the end of the day, we're just going to be a bunch of glowing souls floating around in heaven. Where at least this verse seems to suggest that like there is some aspect of our differences and stuff that like carry with us into heaven. Like that
Yeah.
they're at least like John can see different. He can recognize the like cultural differences and that people look different. People sound different. And kind of I guess my takeaway for this discussion is I feel like Christians. I feel like a lot of times we get this backwards of we start with sort of, well, this isn't fair. This is the more political aspect of the conversation. And then we sort of work back to like, well, like, but diversity is a good thing and we need it. And where I feel like we should start from the other direction of like, okay, the ideal, the heavenly ideal is that it's going to be diverse. Like our culture is going to be diverse, that we are going to be all kind of united. And like we start with that. And then like, from there we work out and like, okay, but like, what's fair? How do we, is what Hollywood policies, is that good or bad? Like we have those discussions, but we start from a place of like, like, yes, we need to, keep in mind like, if it becomes, we're a bunch of white males or losing roles or unfairly or some of that kind of stuff. But like, we can start from a place of like, but it's good to have stories that are diverse and actors that have, that aren't all white males that get different roles and stuff. That's a good thing that we can affirm, even if we maybe quibble and discuss sort of more downstream of it.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's absolutely right. And I think the fact that, at least for the church, like we should all be like celebrating the diversity that has brought us, that, with that diversity, we've all come under the banner of Christ. And I think that's the thing to celebrate. And that yeah, we should not be, it's unfortunate, I think, that like when conversations of diversity come up, that I feel like it's often met with a lot of suspicion. And I think partly because, there have been a lot of issues where, maybe people get hired or they're doing these things simply to check a box, and it doesn't elevate the movie or make anything better. In fact, it makes it worse. And it's not necessarily because it's a diverse hire. It's just because it's like they're bad characters, and there's a certain amount of sort of forced diversity that I think can kind of muddy the waters when we try and have some of these conversations. But I still think they're absolutely worth having in the grand scheme of things. So
yeah, so I think it is something that as Christians, it's a conversation worth sort of wading into, and I think we do owe everyone more than just sort of the reactionary sort of take on Hollywood type lingo and narrative to get to more like the root of what is going on. But kind of actually on somewhat related, because we do get into some of that, like I've mentioned a couple episodes, the last couple episodes. I have a new book coming out, Straight to the Heart, Communicating the Gospel in an Emotionally Driven Culture, which in many ways looks at like, how do you speak to the heart of our culture in sort of some of these conversations like this, and the things that the values like diversity that are driving people today. So real quick, this is 60 seconds. Just want to play a short kind of snippet teaser for that book. Does it ever seem to you like the world today has just completely lost its mind? That people are increasingly driven by their emotions, and it's becoming hard to have rational conversations about faith? This new terrain can be a confusing place to navigate.
What if we were to view the emotion-driven culture all around us not as an insurmountable problem, but as an exciting opportunity? Could it be that a culture driven by the heart is actually primed to receive the gospel in unique ways?
Our book takes a new angle on apologetics, cultural engagement, and spiritual formation by diving into the mysterious depths of the human heart to reveal a God who fulfills all of our deepest desires.
We can speak the heart language to others about God using pathways such as stories, beauty, art, community, and desire.
Our culture is changing, a head culture morphing into a heart culture. As Christians, we need to adapt in order to communicate truth in a rapidly changing world.
Straight to the Heart will equip you to speak effectively to the passions that drive people today without compromising the life-changing truth of the gospel.
So super excited for that book. I think it's an important book. Very proud of it. So we'll have the links to pre-order your copy in the show notes, and I encourage you to do that. But kind of another story that I just found is not as weighty or meaty as diversity and anti-white biases and all that. But I do think it is more amusing, and I do think it is. There is some application for this. So this is something I stumbled upon. Nathan Jones, he's an actor, and he appeared in the recent Mad Max movie Furiosa. Not as a good character. He was a
baddie.
He was a bad guy. He was a bad guy. He was kind of creepy. He was in the movie. Clearly had like sexual interest in Furiosa while she was still a very young girl, and then she gets away, and nothing comes from that. But it does establish that he is a creep. He is a bad guy, and apparently some people saw that and jumped to the conclusion that not only is his character a bad guy, like he himself suffers from those same issues. So he actually had to issue a public statement. He had enough feedback from this, where he says, "Hi everyone, I've noticed a few queries and private messages about my role in Mad Max Furiosa, particularly regarding a scene with young Furiosa. This is a very sensitive subject, and I want to emphasize that it involves a fictional character. The details can be uncomfortable, and as an actor, my job is to portray a character based on the direction and script provided for me. I appreciate your understanding and support in recognizing the distinction between fiction and reality. Thank you, best, Nathan.
Oh, he was acting that. That wasn't like a portrayal of his character, who he is as a person.
I had suspicions when he showed up and he was like in costume and he was like supersized and like on life support.
And it was seeing him in a movie. Was that what tipped you off that this is maybe not Nathan Jones
it
the
seemed
person?
like a weird place to pursue some of those perverted tendencies in a public blockbuster
and on film, no less.
Yeah, it seemed like not a wise choice. So like on the surface, it's just funny. Like I don't know.
Are these just like bot accounts trolling him, or are there legitimately people that are confused about what it means to act?
See, because you would assume surely because of a high view of humanity that it must be bots or something, but this sort of mindset is not it's not everywhere, but it's not nowhere. Like you see this a lot of it's hard for some people, and I think this is a very in your face example of it, but I think in even more subtle ways, it is hard to sort of separate the persona you see in a movie from the people comedians talk a lot about that, in their movie they're real zany and they're always funny in different things, and then they always have a hard time in just social normal settings because it's this guy is like this because that's what I'm familiar with him like that. What do you mean he's not just telling jokes all the time or tons he's just a normal guy and he's having a bad day, or it's sort of that distinction between this person isn't the character that they're portraying, and they can often be very different. That's the beauty of acting, is that you can be very different. And kind of one of the ways where I think this sort of does even apply kind of from a faith perspective, you see a similar thing for this when it comes to actors that are Christian. I know even Alan Richardson, he's the guy from Reacher, and he's been sort of he's really elevating up to he's been in a lot of movies lately. And there was even some feedback because he was in the is it Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, a very violent movie, and he's
behaving ungentlemanly.
He was very ungentlemanly towards some Nazis, and he had to make a kind of a statement too about and even Reacher, he had to make a public video where he sort of said it's fun as an actor to explore different roles and things that are not me, but I myself am not Reacher. This did not happen. I am not literally fighting guys and violently killing them like that. This is a role. And I know other Christian actors and stuff, there's been some of that conversation of just if they portray someone that isn't a Christian, and people have I thought you believed in this, yet this character you're playing is not a pastor. And I think it reflects a more subtle version of the Furiosa thing of just can we differentiate between the role and the actor, and allow people to portray things that are not them.
Yeah, I mean, it's a sad, I guess, commentary on the state of our culture when I guess there is at least a segment that can't possibly understand that people can act in ways that are different from who they are, and that's called acting, and that's a movie, and it's pretend, it's make believe, and it's just really weird. And I think maybe kind of going back to some of the diversity stuff is because you see these I guess people online getting upset when it's this person with two arms played a character who only had one arm. Why didn't you go and hire somebody with just one arm? Or this person played, someone in a wheelchair, or this person played a trans person, but clearly they're heterosexual. How come you didn't find a trans actor to play that? And just this weird sort of obsession with everything on screen in fiction has to match, has to match reality, and it's just a really bizarre place, I think, for our culture to be. And like there are people who are like genuine about this, like, well, how come, like, but it's just it's such a odd thing, I think, for people to fixate on, and I don't really know where it's coming from, other than people, maybe it's the meaning crisis that like people have no meaningful lives, and so they have to go and fight about movies now. Like, I don't know. Like, it's
But I
just
think,
kind
yeah, I
of
think it's a good point though. Like, it's not just like only Christians and Christian actors. Like you
yeah.
said,
Oh, yeah. No, it's like
there
across. It's like,
yeah, there has been some, I guess, momentum or like this a shift where like, yeah, like we expect, like I know that was like the case with like, with like a gay person or like
right,
with whatever it is, like, this idea that the actor needs to be like very closely aligned
with the character they're playing.
the
And
character, which I mean, like that mindset is like, in the scheme of acting, like that's very small, like,
yeah,
even like back to like the original like Greek theater and stuff, like, it was like almost all men that would be actors.
yeah,
So like half of them would have to play the woman role too, and they'd wear masks. And like this idea that like that's what acting is you embody a different character and you explore stuff. And so I thought it was funny that statements like this, that they exist, like this Furiosa, Nathan Jones, the fact that they exist is humorous to me. But I do think, like beyond just the humor of it, like there is something to be said about sort of learning to distinguish between fiction and reality. Kind of another thing I wanted us to just mention, because I know the recent movie A Quiet Place, Day One, just came out a week or so ago, and I am the target audience for these kind of movies. Like, if they have a new Alien movie coming out, like I'll be there. Like anything, any movie about like a shark that's like prowling around,
it's
like
gone rogue.
like, oh man, like I'll
Come up from the depths.
there are very few like shark movies that I have not seen.
Yeah.
I mean, there are very few shark movies that are good, but I've seen them all, even the ones that are not.
Hope springs eternal for the shark movie genre.
But there's just something. There's something about that genre that I've always enjoyed.
Yeah.
I think it's because I love Jaws, and maybe that set me on the path of liking these sort of movies. So I don't know if this is my own like catharsis, my own apology for liking this kind of movie. I don't know if I feel some like some internal guilt about like, as a Christian, is it okay to be entertained by like a bunch of aliens hunting people in New York City and knocking them off and whatever else? Because I know traditionally, even like with some reviews and stuff, like I think some of the opinions have maybe softened a bit, and I think people are more accepting of this type of film. But there are Christians and people that do feel uncomfortable about these types of film, particularly because a lot of them feature violence and they feature death. And again, I don't even mean like if you're just personally uncomfortable with it, like, then don't watch it. Like, I have no problem with people being like, hey, that's like how I feel about some other varieties of horror movies, where like, I don't necessarily think it's like unchristian. I'm just not comfortable with. And hey, I don't have to go see every movie. Like, neither does anyone. It's like, that's not really who we're talking about. It's more the idea that like, is it unchristian to watch this? Like, because that's sort of the takeaway from some comments and stuff and feedback is like, it's, I can't believe you would support a movie like this. So I thought we could kind of get into a little bit about it. And I think, like I said, a lot of it comes down to like the violence of it. Like, people die. There is sort of that horror. These movies are typically a horror, or at least like a thriller. And maybe just the question, like, is all, like, as a Christian, like, is all violence depicted on screen bad? What is the definitive answer for that?
Well, I would say probably definitively no. It's not all bad. But yeah, I think, I think a lot of people who maybe have issues with movies like this, like more the monster horror genre, are probably okay with, again, this is a shot in the dark, but they're probably more okay with violence when it's depicted in like a war movie depicting some historic war. I would guess is an okay, like, type of violence because it sort of serves a greater purpose in their mind of like, hey, this is just, we're remembering, what people had to fight for back in the day, and we're honoring their memory, and part of that is accepting that it was very violent, the things that they had to endure and what they did, and there's some sort of maybe catharsis for that. Whereas like monster movies, maybe I guess their side of it would be like, this is totally unnecessary, and this is just sort of some big spectacle and violence for the sake of violence, and why are you filling your mind with that kind of violence? And that's maybe the level of how they would read a movie like this and say, well, it's not really serving a higher purpose, and so in that sense, maybe it's not okay.
Yeah, because I think that's right. Like I think that's where a lot of we can stomach it more when it's like this is true. When
Yeah.
it's not true, and in the case of like aliens or monsters or things like, even more so, fictional, imaginative, then it seems a little more. You can make a stronger case that like, hey, this isn't just like honoring the truth of reality, but you're actually, you're creating a fiction and then you're showing it. But like thinking about like if you go to like scripture, like is there anything in scripture to that like would like clearly caution or like prohibit Christians from watching a violent movie? And like again, like all these types of questions when you go into scripture is difficult because scripture isn't telling you how to watch Netflix.
Right.
Like it doesn't address directly the questions that we would be helpful for people trying to figure out how to navigate entertainment. Like it doesn't tell you, war movies are okay, but this, when you're watching a movie,
Yeah.
it doesn't even really address like theater or things that were common at that time. But I mean, like, you could make an argument like the Bible itself is very violent, although that is again similar to the war it's telling the truth.
Right.
So that it maybe doesn't speak as clearly, but there's really nothing that would directly sort of like speak to that other than like a more general principle of just like the sanctity of life. Like I think, which is why I think this question about like violent movies and like monster movies like moves more in I think like the area of like wisdom rather than like law, thou shalt not, because I think it is clear in scripture like Christians should have a high view of life and like the sanctity of life, and there is I think something that should make us uncomfortable if we're just like being entertained by death. Like there's something about like where we're taking joy in like the suffering of others, which I would say like I think especially with like monster movies, like I've always said there's two types. Like and you can tell by like who you cheer for. Like there's the ones where you're cheering for the monster and you just can't wait for Kevin over there who's been annoying the whole movie. Like, you just know the monster's going to corner him and like, you hope it's violent and like, you just want the spectacle of death. Like, I think there is a strong case to be made that like Christians should, if nothing else, be very cautious about that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But I think like the other kind of monster movie is where you're cheering for the humans. Like, there is death, people will die, and like that adds just to the weight of the horror and like the situation. But like, you're not cheering for them. You're not taking delight. You're taking delight in the fact that like they escaped the monster and they live to fight another day and they're fighting against sort of these forces of nature and stuff. And kind of thematically, I think there's something more edifying about that kind of view. Which like a movie like A Quiet Place movies, I think that's why I like those movies so much. Is like all three of them have been very much the second variety of like people die, but like really not that many that you see on screen. And like even A Quiet Place Day One, like almost none of the death. Maybe the only death you really see on screen is the one instance of like a human killing a human, and it's portrayed as like a horrible bad thing that not like glorified, but like all the alien stuff like it sort of happens on like the fringes of it, and the focus is more on like these characters and surviving. And I think from that sense, I don't think Christians need to like again still be cautious and discerning, but like I don't personally feel any conviction that like Christians must stay away from that because violence is bad. I think violence has been like a central component to storytelling since like we started telling stories.
Yeah. No, I would tend to agree on that, and I think it's okay to be put in a position to I think because we ourselves, in most of our day-to-day lives, aren't coming into contact with such violence that we can see on screen, I think it can help sort of hyper realize some of those values that are played out on screen, whether that's being courageous or having hope or showing empathy in the face of great adversity. I think all of these things are sort of turned into are brought into very sharp focus in movies, of the monster movie genre, because it's such just horrific circumstances. And I think we can all see ourselves there and like, well, everything's falling apart. What would you do when, there's an interpersonal conflict? And so it's a way of, I think, clarifying some of those moral dilemmas that people have. And I think it can be a very enlightening experience for people. But again, if it's not, your cup of tea, that's okay too. But I do think it can be very much a beneficial thing to go through one of these movies, obviously with some wisdom.
Yeah, more
but
like a case by case, like a
Yeah.
film by film, rather than like this genre is not for Christians.
Right.
Like, I feel like for the most part, that's never a very good
Right.
approach. Like this whole thing, because like you said, I think films are at their best when they're exploring human experiences, and like death and mortality is a human experience. And
Yeah.
I think films like monster movies, if done from the right kind of perspective, can be valuable in that way. But speaking of films and films that you may or may not want to go see as a Christian in theaters, the next segment of this podcast we have out now and coming soon. So really the only a quiet week for movies this week, because the only like wide release film is Fly Me to the Moon, kind of a inspirational drama, romantic comedy. It's a lot of different things, starring Channing Tatum and Scarlett Johansson. And you can check out my review for this on our YouTube channel and our website. I think the movie's fine. I think this movie's not going to do well. I think this is almost like the Fall Guy movie. Like there's, and in some ways that makes me sad. Like again, if it's not a great movie, don't go see it. If it's not your cup of tea, but like there's such a constant like Hollywood, just all they make is sequels and franchises and blockbusters. There's no original stories in Hollywood. And then like whenever an original story comes out in Hollywood that's like not one of those things, like people just never go see it. It's bad, and then it sort of just reinforces that narrative. But I will say there is an interesting moment in this that does like again, check out my review for it. But it seems like it's mocking Christianity, and in a sense, it kind of is. And then it sort of twists and like ends up as a very like positive perspective on Christian themes. And
Who knew?
It was one of those like as I'm watching, I'm like, okay, this is some fodder for the review, and then I go, oh, that's. That didn't go the way I was expecting.
I think it's always good if a movie takes a twist or a turn that you don't expect. I feel like that doesn't
Speaking
happen
of
all the
twists
time.
and turns,
You know what else twists and turns?
Twisters. So next week, that is the big movie for next week. And like we said last episode, I feel like there is a synergy between monster movies and disaster movies.
Oh yeah.
Where they essentially the same template. You just replace an alien with like a hurricane or a twister or a volcano
Or two twisters.
or multiple twisters, and it's the same sort of like, hey, there's destruction, there's these powers that we have no power against, like, and what do we do as humanity to fight back against that? Hey, I'm hoping that that movie is good. But something that I know will be good is what I'm about to hear in the final segment of this episode. We have things we like that you should like too.
Well, I'll pull a bit of an audible this week, Daniel. I was going to talk about one of my favorite food groups, but talking about the title of the movie, Fly Me to the Moon, got me thinking about old Frankie Sinatra and how good he was as a singer. Some of the classic songs, including Fly Me to the Moon. I think for our wedding video, we had a Frank Sinatra song featured. I think it was Come Fly With Me. And we have a few albums from the man himself. And just reminded of how good Frank Sinatra is. I don't know if it's not Norwegian power metal, but I'm sure
Yeah,
you can
might-
appreciate some Frank Sinatra.
I mean, I wouldn't say
Maybe for Christmas.
I mean, Christmas is when I do. Although
Frank and Bean.
there are some good
Yeah,
heavy metal, power metal Christmas albums.
I know, but we're not talking
But
about
that
that.
Christmas is usually the time of the year where I
Yeah.
set aside the metalhead and I actually broaden my horizons. I don't know, is that genre sort of like the crooner?
Yeah.
Is that still a thing? Like I know I'm not.
Well, I mean, I don't know.
musical genres
I don't know like how it ranks in current popularity.
because there's still guys out there that are just like dressing
well,
all
like
dapper and singing these like crooner songs. Like
I don't know. Like I don't know if it's like I don't know beyond the classics. Like I don't know. I mean, I think like Michael Bublé would maybe be
Yeah,
the
he-
one who sort of carried that crooner torch.
which
But
I
I
feel
don't.
like the fact that he's the one that everyone thinks of suggests like there's probably not a whole lot of them.
No, I wouldn't think. I don't think there are like that genre. I don't know that there's a lot of new music being made in that genre. But does there need to be because you've got such great classics already there? So
But there is an opening. I can maybe sort of dust off the vocal pipes and
yeah, find that fedora and go to town.
I do look quite good in a fedora. But hey, we are glad you guys have joined us once again just to dive into. It is one of the fun things with this podcast is just every week just asking questions and especially things like this week with some of the diversity, like to wade into things where again we're working it out as we we're currently, each week working this out. I think as Christians, that
Yeah.
is a help. I think if ever you get to a place where you just have all these answers and you just need to recite the answers you've already decided. I don't think that's a healthy place for Christians. I think these are things, again, start with scripture, but then kind of work out of just continually having these conversations. So we are glad that you have joined us, and we hope that you will join us next week, next Thursday, as always, for more conversations on faith and pop culture.